We're here to talk about market research. I'd love to I know that, you are our expert when it comes to market research at RKD. And so I'd love to just hear like your spiel on market research, why it's important, why brands need to invest in it.
I think that is a great point. And I want to start off by saying that brands don't necessarily need to invest money into this. It might just be investing time because not all market research requires a large expenditure of dollars. Certainly, that's a part of it, depending on the objectives of the research. But I think research really runs the gamut between just a relational donor check in all the way to a pre-post methodology for maybe a capital campaign that we wanted to measure the marketing effectiveness of it, or actually just measuring a message or creative test without actually risking any revenue. So I think that the applications of market research are certainly varied, and that also is the case with budgets. But I always caution that we don't necessarily need to have a big expenditure in order to have some really good market research findings from our supporters.
I love it. And so the first part of the conversation I'd like to talk to you about is the marketing and the branding aspect of market research. So my first question is, how can market research help nonprofits understand how they're perceived by their donors compared to, other organizations in their community or the nation or even the globe? And then why does that matter for their long-term growth?
It's such a great question because I really feel that this is the next layer of how nonprofits are going to widen their support base. So we all know that marketing is great for upper funnel consideration and growth. And market research really plays a key part in the measurement of that. And we're talking about brand metrics that matter. We are talking about the organization or brand's unaided awareness, aided awareness, the trust, the actual consideration for a gift. And ironically, there's such a correlation between awareness and trust and share of wallet. In other words, the support for that brand. And that's a big reason that we start our competitive brand assessments. So you had mentioned wanting to understand how a brand stacks up against others. We call that the competitive set. And that really consists of different brands or organizations that provide similar services. Maybe it's in that same regional area. Maybe it is a nationwide consideration. But we really want to understand the unaided and aided awareness for the brand versus the competitive set. And we also, in turn, want to understand the trust measures, because when we combine aided awareness and trust, that has a near perfect correlation with share of wallet or donation consideration.
So you touched on the different kinds of donor perceptions. What do you think are the hardest for nonprofits to see without that formal market research?
That's a really good question. I would say that awareness is an easy one to kind of understand. We all know the different organizations in a market or nationwide. We can look up the top nonprofits from freely available market research. It's really the trust component that I think is usually a surprise for brands. And trust is interesting because it increases sequentially with awareness. And it does so unless there is a negative press incident. So an example of that is as awareness increases, trust also increases, unless there has been maybe some negative publicity or a story that made it into the news. Lots of times we read about the CEO that perhaps did something unscrupulous. That will really ratchet down trust, as you would imagine. But with the lack of that negative press event, awareness really boosts trust. And that increase in trust is really important because, again, those two together are really going to have a very high correlation with share of wallet.
You alluded to this earlier about that, nonprofits are working with limited budget for marketing. So in your experience, how have you seen nonprofits use that brand research to make smarter decisions about where to invest that limited budget that they're working with?
That's a great question. So I think that if a organization has never conducted a brand study and they're maybe flying a little blind in terms of where they fall in terms of their ranking versus the competitive set, that's always a great spot to do some preliminary or baseline research. So when we can baseline a brand's perceptions, including not only the awareness and trust measures that we talked about, but also different brand perceptions on the services that they provide. So maybe if it is a human services organization or brand, we will assess the perceptions of maybe if they provide job training or housing first solutions. We really want to gauge what those perceptions are so that we can baseline that and compare it to where the brand wants to go. And then in that way, we can do almost a pre-post measurement with the market research. The first preliminary measurement is that baseline. Where were things before we had that intentionality of a potential, maybe it's a specific communication plan or a series that talks about what is really important to the organization to grow. Maybe it is more awareness of training for education and employment purposes. And in that way, we're able to create that baseline measurement so that we can decide which are the elements, which are the levers that we want to pull toward the goals of communicating what is most important to that brand and the constituency.
Okay, so I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about creative visuals and messaging and testing around that. Using research. A lot of times nonprofits resort to making decisions around that based on their intuition or their past performance, which I think there's value in that probably.
Absolutely.
But why is it risky? Why do you think it's risky to solely depend on that when they're developing messaging and creative?
It is best explained by if you've ever participated in a conference and usually there's a creative session and it's titled something like which test won. And I love this guessing game because us all as fundraisers in the room typically guess incorrect about more than half of the time, right? And you figure it's a 50-50 shot at that. And I think that is really indicative that we are not always our target audience, right? We live and breathe this on a daily basis, and we see the creative and messaging in ways that potentially our donor and support bases don't. And so I think that is the number one reason of just realizing that we're not always our target audience. And so it's really important to do some pre-testing on the messages or creative so that we can get a sense of their performance, importantly, without risking any revenue.
We know that it's really important to kind of tailor our communications and how people are seeing us for different audiences, like new donors versus our long-term supporters. And so how can that testing help nonprofits to better tailor their messaging and their videos for those different key audiences that they
Great question. So when we talk about targeting, it's going to be best targeted for the affinity of that intended recipient. So affinity measures are going to be super predictive. So that just means what is important to that supporter. If you and I were having a relational conversation, I would want to get to know you better, right? And that is that mid to major relational conversation that we really want to make sure that we're hitting at scale for a mass market or individual fundraising program. So understanding what's important to them, in other words, affinity measures, are going to be super important so that we can target the messaging correctly. And that's kind of the what, the message. And then in terms of the how, we can also ask questions very easily in terms of preferred method or channel of donation. And in the past, this was more cut and dried, where if you were younger, you of course are going to respond online. And if you're older, you're still holding out for that direct response, check in the mail methodology. But the world is increasingly more multi-channel, and that's a good thing. But the most surprising bit about the research on this that I've conducted over the last about 14 years is the fact that about 50 to 60% of all generations and ages prefer to give online. As if they had to pick just one channel and just one way to give, they would prefer to give online. And that really is a testament to the fact that we need to be more integrated in terms of our communication set, but also taking into account those preferences of donors and supporters. And one way we can glean that information without any surveys or market research is, of course, looking at the very predictive behaviors. So, in other words, looking at where and how the donor chooses to give is very, very predictive, that they're sending you a very distinct signal that I gave through an event. I prefer to give through events, or I've given my last 2 gifts digitally, and we can infer that that's their preferred channel of not only communication, but also response.
Love it. What are some examples of the types of pivots that a nonprofit could make in their messaging and their visuals if they test it before it goes live to their audiences, and they later look at their campaign results and go, oh, I
Right.
would have done that in retrospect if I had known that.
Right, right. And I guess that's the beauty of doing a creative evaluation online through market research. And that market research could be conducted of the donor base, maybe those donors that have a valid emailable address, so that we can just send them a distinct survey link to, hey, spend 3 minutes giving us your thoughts. Or it can utilize panel-based research or traditional market research. And if you're not familiar with panels, they simply are composites of millions of people who have opted in to take surveys in exchange for points, redeemable for gift cards and travel and the like. So these panels are a really effective way to target in on our charitable donor population. It averages just over 50% for the last dozen years of the proportion of US adults who give charitably. So, in other words, about just over half of the US adult population does give charitably. And that's typically our focus for a that's typically our focus for a market research study. And through that, we can really test all sorts of different elements and even go a little bit more crazy on the market research than I would a donor research. Donor research has to be really tight, really easy for the donor, and super, super short. Whereas for market research, these folks are being incented for their time via these points redeemable for gift cards and the like. So I can take things a little bit longer, a little bit more in depth. I can ask more questions, and I can also evaluate different versions of creative. And that's super important because a lot of brands prefer to be a little bit more positive. And a great example of that is for animal welfare. We don't necessarily want to hear the Sarah McLachlan soundtrack playing as we're looking at some of the creative for a brand. And so what the market research does is it finds those offers that are just as successful as some of the more heart-wrenching imagery that are more upbeat and positive. And a way that we're doing that is by getting the first person perspective, say having the arm of a human petting a dog and getting that almost visceral response of feeling the softness of the fur and getting that serotonin boost. So research can really help identify alternate offers so that A, we might be able to mix up some of the offers to feel a little bit fresher. And B, we can also quantify the potential performance, which tends to correlate very well to actual testing. And in that way, the nonprofit can use their funds very, very smartly to make sure that we are maximizing return on investment and making sure that our creative is hitting the way we are hoping it could.
Right. Okay. Moving on to, I want to talk about dynamic content optimization, or DCO. It's been a big topic of interest here at RKD as of late. How does market research help nonprofits to move from that broad messaging to more personalized messaging across their different donor audiences?
Yeah. I love the topic of dynamic content optimization, and I love some of the tools that we are using to do that. And I think it goes hand in hand with market research because dynamic content optimization really pulls from a pool of creative and offers. And what we really want to do through market research is expand that pool and especially look at it via the different profiles that we all have in the different supporter bases. So in other words, dynamic content optimization is going to be fantastic to say, oh, of these 5 different offers, I'm going to give this website visitor offer number 1. And we use market research to really expand those offers so that we might be able to pull from maybe 10 different offers that are going to resonate to a general audience. And then dynamic content optimization can really hone in on which of those versions are going to convert the best in terms of maybe it's a little bit different of an offer or a message, or it has different creative, et cetera. And that's really going to go back to the affinity areas that we are addressing and really understanding from the research, because we want to understand the elements or affinities that are really important to our supporter base, because that is going to be one of the most predictive elements of performance.
Are you seeing that research is helping people to optimize their messaging and their visuals across different channels as well, like email and direct mail and digital ads?
Absolutely. So the benefit of research that we do is, even though the majority of it is conducted online, there are some exceptions. It is really getting to all of the segments that we are interested in. When I started my career, my research career about 30 years ago, we had to use mixed mode research because older generations weren't online in the same way that others were. That is obviously not the case now. We can absolutely get a very valid representation of some of these different age groups. And the age groups, even though it's becoming, as I mentioned earlier, there's more of a parity for those donors that prefer to give online. It's about 50 to 60% of all ages do prefer to give online. Even though it's more at a parity, there are some subtle, distinct differences. And so I think by looking at the data by some of these profiles and demographics of interest, we're able to better tailor these communications so that they can then be optimized one step further through a dynamic content optimization process or tool.
And for nonprofits that are new to that level of personalization, like, how do you think that research can help them to prioritize, just where to start with optimizing?
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And here again, I don't think it needs to be a very expensive initiative. Even if we were to rank order the programs or services of a nonprofit, that is going to get so much rich affinity information and intelligence. So this is something that it might be part of a 3-question donor survey just to see what's important to them. And it can really be packaged as just a true donor check-in. And this again is just trying to scale more relational strategies, because we do want to understand what makes our donors and supporters tick. We do want to understand which of the many programs a brand provides really resonate with those targeted audiences. So I would argue that we don't even need to do a in-depth creative evaluation. It doesn't need to be a large, expensive study. It can just be a standard check-in. It can be a few question survey where we're asking these folks, hey, could you rank order the different services that we provide, because we want to understand what's important to you.